Roger Federer's competitors said that it often felt like he was in the Matrix, like he had an extra second to get to each ball compared to everyone else. In sports, we spend so much time talking about the tangible aspects of size, of speed, of strength, that we often overlook the colossal impact that the brain and the motor control system have on skill. It's unlikely that Roger was truly that much faster or that much stronger than other athletes. What's more likely is that he was better at anticipating the shot and deciding how to play it. Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing Zach Schonbrun. Zach wrote the book, The Performance Cortex, which is a deep study into the often misunderstood ways that the brain impacts sports performance. In this episode, we talk about how athlete brains differ from non-athletes, what is the real meaning of genius in athletes and in others, and why promising new technology often doesn't get adopted by elite athletes. Zach, welcome to the Exponential Athlete Podcast.
Thank you.
I read your book. I really enjoyed it. Probably one of the books that made me think more about what the definition of sports performance is that I've read over the last couple of years. And I'm really excited to have you to come on because I think you've done one of the most unique meta-analyses of how the brain fits into sports, more so than the body or some of these other things. So again, welcome. And I'm excited to really dive into this with you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ken. It's great to be here with you.
So kicking things off, a lot of sports performance is focused on the physical body, focused on the tangible things, the strength that people have, their speed, all these other things. At a broad level, I know this is a huge question. What role does the brain play in sports performance?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question because I did write the book about this. No, the short answer is everything. And you know, it's not something that I realized or recognized before I really started on this project, because I think, as you mentioned, there's so much focus in the sports industry and coaching and training, and even as fans and sports writers, which is what I was, on the physical, on the muscles and the speed and the strength of athletes as being the key, if not the only differentiator, you know, between what makes a superior performer and somebody who's not so much. But the brain is everything. There's an argument that to be made, and Daniel Wolpert, who's somebody who I interviewed in the book, makes this argument very clearly, that the only reason we have a brain is for movement. It's not for thinking. It's not for emotions. It's not for memory. It's not for love. All those things come secondary to the brain's primary purpose, and that is to coordinate and orchestrate movement, skilled movement. Things that are inanimate, like bushes or trees or rocks, they don't have brains. Wolper likes to bring up there's a sea creature, I think it's like a sea cucumber, that is born with a brain and a central nervous system, and it swims around the ocean in its adolescent phase until it finds a nice hunk of coral, and it plops itself down, promptly eats its own brain, and never moves again. Which is kind of like how I feel when I sit on the couch and I turn on Netflix. I'm just like, but the purpose of the brain is to orchestrate and coordinate skilled movement. And if you think about the brain in that context, in that very important context where movement is primary and everything else comes secondary, I think it kind of naturally pairs with the idea or the concept that those who are able to move in extraordinary ways, like athletes, like performers, are using their brains in extraordinary ways. They're using their brains in intelligent ways. There's an intelligence there that I think is very underappreciated, underrespected, you know, when talking about performance and athleticism. Normally, when we talk about athletes and their brains, even today, it's in a context of strategizing or thinking. Conversely, when you're talking about athletes who maybe are not so strong at strategizing or thinking, they're not using their brains, right? And this is just a total fallacy, and it's a misrepresentation of what the brain is actually doing. So I think linking the brain to intelligence and to athletic, whatever you want to call it, if it's athletic intelligence or athletic genius, you know, I don't even like using that qualifier anymore. I think it is a real form of of intelligence. Thinking about the brain in that way, I think you have to then, where performance today is missing out is not thinking about ways that training and practice should be aimed at improving the brain rather than the muscles or the speed or the strength. Again, that stuff can become secondary. The performance and the ways that, the sports should be geared toward training, neuroplasticity, motor learning, it all should be aimed at focus on the brain, and the rest will come secondarily. So, from working on this book, and we can get into, how I landed on this on this subject, which was pretty happenstance, but it's completely changed how I look at athletes, how I consider them, and I no longer think of them and think just about the muscles or the speed or the quantifiable things that we typically think about. I think about what their cognitive processing is like, what their perception, their decision making, their memory, all those things that are contained, underneath the batting helmet.
Yeah, and I think it probably varies pretty dramatically by sport as well. So something like hitting a golf ball, hitting a baseball, hitting a tennis ball, kicking a soccer ball, those have different skill elements than maybe an endurance sport. I think the endurance sports or even speed sports, they have some of these elements as well. I mean, I've been doing a lot of research on Michael Phelps recently, and he's talking about the 100-meter butterfly that he swam, where he just eked it out. I think it was in 2008, where he took essentially an extra stroke, whereas the other guy glided to the finish.
Right.
That was a something he had practiced. That was something that was ingrained in that was how he was going to finish the race, even if it wasn't how he prepared. Obviously, still a skill and brain portion there, but there is this spectrum across different sports. I would like to ask you, not just across the different sports, but what types of genius are there in athletes? So you might have proprioception, which is our understanding of our body. There's probably, you talk about it in the book, the ability for us to be prediction engines. So a baseball player or a tennis player predicting what's going to come next. Are there other types of this genius that you would describe, or those maybe the main two?
No, I mean, I think, to understand the genius of an athlete like a LeBron James, I think you have to go back to the basics of how complex any given, even ordinary movement is. And that was something that I tried to do in the book, was trying to talk to researchers, not only about, elite athletes, but about the very fundamentals of how we move. It was kind of the driving question around what I was going for, was there was just, how do we move? How do I reach for this cup of water and bringing it up to my lips without it shaking and dropping? And the complexity of this task, of this movement, is easily or best understood by thinking about where we are in robotics today. Okay, with all the intelligence that we have with artificial intelligence and with machine learning and all this stuff, and computers that can beat us in chess and go, robotics, if there may be a robot out there that can do that can reach for this cup, bring it up to a lips, put it back down, but it probably took 3 to 5 years to build.
And it probably takes 30 seconds to still do it. So I have a great segue. I was at NVIDIA's conference this year, GTC. Obviously, the other side of my life is in data science, AI, machine learning. And they had these machines making coffees. And it's a robot arm making this coffee. And it's taking it 3 minutes to make a cup of coffee. And I'm like, why even show this off? If it's a robot, I don't want to see it unless it's faster than I am.
Yeah.
But that's what I was realizing. I was connecting it to your book, is that the robots don't have these feedback mechanisms. It's all visual processing.
Yeah.
The sensors, the sort of, in computer terms, it'd be edge computing, where at the end of the reach, the sensors have their own individual feedback loops. And then as humans, as you said in the book, our hands have internal feedback loops that don't necessarily go all the way up to the brainstem or touch the central nervous system. And so to me, that was such like a cool thing to be able to connect these two different sides of my life and be able to see where AI was deficient in that sense, or maybe it's more robotics was deficient.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's certainly a sensory component that's missing in robotics, and that's a big part of it. But there's also just a motor component, a motor complexity that robotics can figure out. It just takes a while. It takes a long time. And then if you adjust this cup, if you make it a different size cup or put it in a different direction, they can't do it. So, thinking about how complex it is for you or I to actually do this, to reach out for something, to walk down the street without getting hit by a car or not bunking into everybody else on the street. Thinking about the basics of movement, I think then gives you a certain new appreciation for how LeBron James is able to dribble down the court in a fast break and throw a behind the back pass perfectly timed to a teammate. It's extraordinary genius level brain processing computation. And I think there's no real one or two elements of the brain that he needs to incorporate in order to make that happen. It's a multitude. It's prediction, it's memory, it's decision making, not to mention the coordination of the brain to the body, moving the muscles in the proper way. That's why, taking all that together, I think that elite athletes display intelligence and genius that is on par with someone who we would typically think of a genius, right? The kind of the conventional
physicist or whatever
genius term.
Be,
yeah. If we are remarking and marveling at their work using their brains, why not athletes? So that's kind of the theory there.
I would imagine, and this is not a scientifically backed opinion, I want to caveat that, but there's different genius in different parts of the brain that we use. We're talking more about the prefrontal cortex with people that are coming up with, theories in math or physics or some of these other areas. And it's probably other areas of the brain that are unbelievably well adapted in these athletes. And I think it's kind of fun to think about it in those types of things. It's still the brain. It's still genius.
Right.
We're just indexing on different things. I mean, you brought up in the book the taxi study of people mapping in space of the London taxi drivers. Well, they have to pass that test. And they're, I forget what
think it was the hippocampus.
The hippocampus is dramatically larger and more developed in them than other people. And to me, it's the same thing, is that maybe we don't have the science or the technology to evaluate how a tennis player or a soccer player's brain is different from the normal human. Maybe we do. Maybe people have looked into that. But I would imagine that there is some development in these different areas of the brain than, again, what we would describe as traditional intelligence.
Yeah.
Something that I'd be interested in asking. So I just finished this Federer series. I'm very deep in the weeds on this. So many people described Federer as seeming like he had an extra step. He had more time, an extra second. He could freeze time. He could do these things that no one else could. Can you maybe hypothesize about what are some of the elements that goes into him being able to have more time when he's returning a serve, or when he's returning a shot to his forehand side or something like that?
No, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what Federer is doing, but it ultimately comes down to prediction. We're prediction engines. We are constantly having to make predictions based on our surroundings and what we're encountering. Athletes, especially because they're working on such incredibly fast timescales, they don't have time to react to the things that they need to if they were just standing stationary and not expecting or not predicting what's to come. It would be impossible for them to react. Baseball is another good example of this, and how baseball hitters use predictions in order to make contact with the ball. I mean, a baseball, I believe, traveling at 95 miles per hour arrives at the plate in like 3 to 4/10 of a second, which is obviously very fast. And, that doesn't account for the fact that about half of that time is taken up by just the amount of time it takes for the brain to send signals to the body to move, right? Even though the batter is standing at a ready to move, it still takes a little bit of time for that signal to be sent, and they have to decide whether or not to swing or not swing at that pitch. So there is a decision being made in that short amount of time about whether or not to move or not move. And it also doesn't account for the deceptiveness that a pitcher might use to throw off the batter's timing, whether it's with the windup changing, or the length of a pitcher's stride can also impact. If they're a tall pitcher can get closer to the plate than a shorter pitcher. So How does a batter do it? The batter is making predictions based off of subtle cues that he or she is able to pick up from the pitcher's delivery, from watching the hand of the ball coming out of the hand. And a lot of those cues are generated from just intensive amounts of practice, long hours in the batting cage, and many games played in which you're watching these pitchers. It's why film and why hitters watch so much film of the pitchers they're going to face, is they want to see the timing, they want to see the ball coming out of the pitcher's hand. And it's interesting because there is something that's a little bit indefinable about a current athlete's ability to predict what's going to unfold, even relative to an ex-athlete, or certainly a journalist like myself, or even a coach. And there was a really interesting study that was done sometime around 2008, 2007 in Italy, where the researchers they had somebody shooting a free throw, and they had a camera on the fingertips of the basketball player shooting the free throw, and the video was zoomed in to show the ball released from the fingertips, and that was it. That's the only thing they show. They didn't show they showed a little bit of the release, but they didn't show whether the ball was going in or not. They occluded that portion, and they had players guess based off of what they were seeing about whether or not the ball was going to go in. And the players, the teammates, were by far more accurate about predicting that whether the shot was going to go in than coaches, than trainers, and even ex-players. So there is something about active expertise that gives an advantage to just that prediction element. And whether or not it's just picking up cues that other people aren't doing, or that aren't able to pick up on, it's not really clear about what that is, but the evidence shows that there is something that is extraordinary about being an active expert in making those predictions. So that's what Federer is able to do. He's not reacting. It's not reaction time. There's everybody talks about, he has fast reaction time or hand-eye reaction, hand-eye coordination. Most of us have just about the same reaction time with reaching tasks. There's really not a huge difference in that, because there's just, there's only so much we can do with that motion.
There's a theoretical limit based on our neurons and stuff as well.
Totally. Right? Exactly. So what somebody's able to do, like Federer, to react, is predicting.
Interesting. Well, this is connecting a couple data points in my brain. So you wrote a great piece on your newsletter about deception. Mm-hmm. In tennis in particular, and you looked at Djokovic and Federer. And, early in the match, I think Federer was really good at picking up body language that would indicate where a shot would go. Mm-hmm. And part of the mental game of tennis is Djokovic is trying to disguise what he's doing when he hits an individual shot. Part of predicting is reading the body language or the subconscious or things that the other person does in order to get the hit the shot in a specific location. And this is a little bit of a leap as well. Again, this is not backed by science. I want to be very clear about that. But something I learned about Federer is he was unbelievably empathetic. He was unbelievably curious about people. He was constantly observing other people around him. And if you're constantly aware of other people and their mannerisms, these types of things, you might be picking up more about their body language and these types of things when you're playing against them as well. And I'm not saying that this is causal. I want to be very clear about that. But there might be something to that where effectively he is observing the other people more than everyone else. Mm-hmm. And because of that, he might be a slightly better prediction engine than these other people, because he's picking up some of these other cues. He's really studying these cues. A great example we talked about offline is Andre Agassi. This was a conscious cue, but when he was playing McEnroe would basically stick his tongue in the direction that he would serve. Right. And so he could go ahead and predict. And he started off, I think, with a roughly even or maybe a losing record against McEnroe, and then he basically figured him out because of this tongue thing. Yeah,
but that's a tell.
Yeah, my thought is that there's probably subconscious tells that Federer is picking up on more so than a lot of these other athletes. Mm-hmm. Djokovic is, as his career has evolved, probably gotten really great at that as well. But it's interesting to see those connections between the characteristics of Federer and this seemingly unrelated thing that is his ability to have like an extra step or to be able to get to some of these shots that he wouldn't to begin with.
Yeah. I mean, that's like the game within the game, right? I mean, that, the example of Djokovic and Federer, in which there was a study last year done on that looked at, I think it was the 2016 French Open or US Open, or no, maybe it was Wimbledon. It was some 5-set classic between Federer and Djokovic. This was later in their career, so they had already met each other.
2018.
2018,
the one that Djokovic won.
Yeah,
it was like a heartbreaker for Federer.
Yeah, probably one of the last real titles that Federer was really competing in. And so the study looked at how much deception, how they were deceiving where their shots were going to go. So they would set up for a ball or a return, and their body would set up to go down the line, but instead at the last moment they would trick and hit cross court. And this happened over and over again, and it was very purposeful and intentional that they were trying to deceive their opponent. And this is kind of like next level, gamesmanship. You just don't see it very often. And it's partly because they had matched up and met each other so many times at that point that they knew that they could predict what each other's shots were going to be. And they're so smart in strategizing, again, using their brain in a conscious way, in strategizing, that, they figured out that they could employ deception to keep their opponent off guard. They were at a point in their career with that deception would not throw their regular game off, right? Like that's kind of a key element here. If you're just an up and coming player or a mid-level player, you're just trying to get the basics down and get, hone your own skills, to then trying to throw wrinkles of deception in there it might actually engender bad habits that are tough to get out of. They're at a point where their shots were so down, and they had their basic skills so locked in that they could kind of take that next step into deception. And it's if you can do that, it can be very helpful.
Well, to me, that is even exploiting the habit formulation. So you talked in the book about how habits are good because they habitualize something, but they're bad because that reduces flexibility.
Yeah.
There's essentially this continuum that we work off of. And if Djokovic or Federer is disguising a shot, they're playing on the habits of the other player to adapt to that. Mm-hmm. Whereas by, actually changing what the outcome is, mm-hmm. they're now preying on the weakness of the habit that's been created. It's maybe 40 chess at this point, but, yeah, but exactly. to me that I love that nuance, because that shows how deep the rabbit hole can go. Mm-hmm. And it's not just a physical, it's not just a strategy. Like these are micro things. Hey, you think about fighting, right? I mean, I always think of that Conor McGregor Jose Aldo fight, where Conor McGregor basically called his shot about him charging in, and he studied all this film. He knew that if he feinted this way, he would come charging in and would effectively do this. And it's like, well, everyone is trying to play one step ahead, but you're preying on the reflexes, you're playing on the habitualized movement of these other people.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And goes back to what I said at the beginning, where everything needs to be contextualized and thought about in the context of the brain, and everything else comes secondary. I mean, if you were to take, I don't know if this to be true with Federer or with Djokovic, but I'm guessing that if you were to take any of Federer's measurables, as far as how fast he runs, or how fast he swings, how hard he hits, I don't think there's anything necessarily particularly extraordinary about him. Right? His measurables.
It almost wouldn't be. His serve in terms of speed and these types of things were fast, but not incredibly fast. Not like a Isner or someone along those lines.
Right.
I mean, sorry, continue.
And so what are the things that differentiate him, right? What makes him skilled? If you're just going to say, oh, he's skilled at hitting the ball hard, and he's skilled at this, he's skilled at that, you're just going around in circles saying he's skilled at being skilled. So what is he actually good at? And I think eventually you're going to come to, there's something about his brain that is different than other people. And so, a big problem in sports today is that part of it is neglected and ignored. And the reason I know this is because we just had the NFL draft a few weeks ago. There was an NFL scouting combine where what did they measure? They measured how fast the guy runs, how hard how high he jumps, how big his hands are. And, that can tell you some things, but it continues to lead teams astray, missing on the real crux of what makes a extraordinary performer.
Well, so I think that opens up a really good question is how do you measure what you're just describing?
Yeah.
I mean, it's been really hard. And I would argue one of the reasons why they don't measure that is because there's no really good metrics for assessing football-based or sport-specific cognitive performance.
Yeah.
And so what is the solution to that? Because I believe that is a logical next step for people to evaluate.
Yeah.
But just evaluating how fast a ball moves on a screen or something along these lines, to the best of my knowledge, that doesn't necessarily transfer very well.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a good question. I mean, I think broadly, what the answer to that is just not spending so much time focused on the things you can measure, and more actively thinking about the brain and the role that plays, even if there aren't perfect. Yeah, like you said, there aren't perfect imaging techniques. There's not brain scanners that hitters can wear in the batting cage right now that can scan brains and tell you, oh, this guy's prefrontal cortex is activating more than the other guy. Let's cut him and keep him. No, that stuff is not here yet. But I think
the players' union would also absolutely.
Yeah, we don't have to go into that, Ken. That's a whole other can of worms. Yeah, but I think more broadly, just thinking about and coming into scouting or whatever, or training with the mindset that my focus is going to be on how this guy or girl's brain is wired and is working, and then the other stuff is secondary. I mean, I think that's the first step as far as actually effectively analyzing how athletes use the brain. I mean, the company that I wrote about in the book is DeCervo, and they were using EEG headsets to track decision making and in the brains of hitters, and they were working with Major League Baseball teams in doing this. It's why I followed them and their work. Baseball happens to be a particularly convenient and a more natural fit for this type of analysis because you have kind of one metric, one individualized scenario, situations that unfold that can be much more easy to measure, right? Each pitch, a whole thing, a whole narrative, a whole scenario happens, and you can measure everything that happens pitch by pitch by pitch. Basketball and football is much more fluid. It's a little bit harder to make assessments on decision making, but baseball, the hitter is making a decision on each pitch, right? They are deciding whether or not to swing or not to swing. And it, that's all it is. We've always known when a hitter decides to swing because he swings, but the same decision or the same processing is taking place when the hitter decides not to swing, when he's like, no, it's not a ball I want to swing at. So being able to measure when that decision was taking place requires some neuroimaging system. In this case, it was EEG that DeCervo was using, and they were using a simulation of a pitching coming from a hitter's perspective. Again, is it perfect or was it perfect? No, it wasn't perfect, but they were able to get some interesting readings and make some interesting, draw some interesting relationships and conclusions between someone who's deciding faster and more accurately and having a better, on base percentage and hitting the ball better. So that sort of taking those sorts of steps, just thinking about the decision making rather than just the 40 time, I think is the first step that has to happen in the sports industry.
Yeah, well, I mean, you think about a perfect example who's very popular these days is Tom Brady, right? Where from a measurables perspective, There were questions about his arm strength. There's questions
Yeah.
about his speed, any of these types of things. But clearly he has something psychologically that very few other people have.
Mhm.
I would argue it's being able to understand where everyone on the field is, be able to create this map of the world, and then also be able to, anticipate where people are going to be to throw to them.
Yeah.
Right. What a quarterback does is part physical. You have to be able to throw the ball. You have to be able to move a little bit, but I think he's proved pretty clearly that that is way less important than having
Yeah, he
whatever
couldn't
that
move.
other intangible
Yeah.
thing is. So what we just talked about with Tom Brady, many might consider his football IQ,
Mhm.
his understanding of the field, his understanding of space. I'd heard LeBron talking with JJ Redick on their new podcast about how LeBron, when the coach draws up a play and the coach says to flip it, it's really easy for him to do, but he sees that other players really struggle with that action. Maybe that's his understanding of space, his understanding of how a basketball play works. I think that also points to what a basketball IQ is. But that's something that's really been hard to define, is just sports IQ overall. How would you maybe more broadly define that with what you know about our processes, our learning techniques, and how athletes maybe view the world or can interpret the world differently?
Yeah. I mean, I think with Brady and LeBron, I mean, I think you know, there's a lot of experience there that goes into it. LeBron, when he came up, probably as a rookie, would not have been able to say that he could flip the court that way. He probably, and maybe there were veterans that were like, "Oh, this rookie LeBron, he can't do any of the stuff that I can do." I think that comes, yeah, and same thing with Tom Brady, who played for a long, long time. Both these guys played for 20 years. So, with experience, with the amount of reps in the practice that they have, they do see the field differently. They see the court differently because they have effectively practiced and seen almost every scenario that's out there. But what Tom Brady is doing is a little bit like what we do in a way, and that sounds stupid, but what we do when we walk down the street. Okay. When you're walking down the street, your brain is keeping a mental map of everything that's going on. And now you might not obviously know this is happening, probably on your phone, or you're talking to somebody, or you're looking around. But even if you are looking at your phone as you're walking, which I wouldn't encourage, but even if you are doing that and your focus is elsewhere, the brain is still keeping a track of your surrounding. It knows what it's passing by. It knows the markers of what's happening, of what things are going, and when the red light is going to turn green ahead of you. And it knows this because it knows that you passed by a parking meter, because let's say, oh, I forgot my keys in my car. If I turn around, I'm not going to just whack into that parking meter most of the time. I mean, because the brain has kept a map and it is modeling what's going on around. So it knows you pass by that parking meter. If I turn quickly, that's where it's going to be. Quarterbacks also have a mental map, a model of what's happening on the field and where their receivers are going to be. This is happens and is developed through practice. It's why they practice the routes they're going to have. But Brady, because of that modeling and that system, he doesn't have to be looking at the receivers to know where they're going to be. And that has to do with the way the brain is modeling and creating mental representations about where the receiver is going to be. He still has to make adjustments on the fly, because the thing that's unpredictable about this modeling is the defenders, right? You can try and predict where they're going to be, but that isn't always the case. They can always throw you off. So that's why maybe at the last moment, he has to look and make sure his receiver is where he wants it, he thinks it's going to be, and the defender is not in the way of where that pass is going to go. Through practice, through experience, those models and that mental map, I think probably becomes sharper, and Brady can rely more on his map of where things are going to be, rather than having to use his eyes to look. And so he can keep an eye on the defenders, on the linemen that are crashing down on him. I think that element probably can be developed through, or is developed through practice and experience. But it's something that the brain is capable of producing for all of us as we're going about our daily lives. So, I mean, the thing that I like to say more broadly is like, LeBron, Tom Brady, they weren't born to play football or basketball, even though they might say they were. People say, their brains are not there just for basketball or football. I mean, the brains are there to do a lot of other things. They just happen to have really highly attuned brains for when they are in a football game or in a basketball game. Their brains can click on and perform the task that they've been practicing to perform in extraordinary ways. But it's the same kind of brain that you or I have as we're walking down the street. I mean, it's an amazing organ. It's an amazing instrument that enables us to do a lot of these basic movements that we take for granted, walking, reaching. And so, it's those very basic principles are the same things that Brady and LeBron James are relying on to get done what they need to get done.
Well, some of my favorite research relating directly to this is, are you familiar with the chess masters and their memory? Mm-hmm. So with grandmasters, they set up a chessboard. And if the grandmasters, or if it was something that could happen over the course of a normal game, then the grandmasters could recall this almost uniformly across the board. They had very good recollection of all the pieces on the board. Whereas a normal person struggled to get very many of them, however many is generally in working memory. But if they randomly set up the board, then the grandmasters were no better than normal humans. What they discovered is the grandmasters had this pattern recognition, their ability to chunk dramatically better, to be able to see bigger pictures and recognize the patterns that were on the board. And to me, it's very similar, like just what you're describing is Tom Brady, when he's walking down the street with his mental map, is he knows, oh, there's a gas station on the corner. Next to that gas station, there's a McDonald's and there are these other things. It's just, oh, there's a bigger chunk of the world that he probably sees. I think something interesting, and it's something I've observed by extending this metaphor maybe a little too far, is that when I'm trying to learn, let's say a map, I move to a new location. If I just follow my Google Maps every day, I don't get a feeling of the location very well. If I consciously try to go through and draw a picture of the neighborhood or look at this overview, I actually start to remember where things are dramatically better. I would imagine that LeBron and Tom Brady were maybe taking a more dedicated approach to creating this mental map, maybe studying plays differently or thinking about things conceptually. We talk about flipping the court or not flipping the court. Maybe they were practicing that. Yeah. Whereas other people are just doing effectively what they're told, and they aren't ingraining this same level of knowledge. Are there ways that you've seen that we could improve our mental model of the world, improve our skill acquisition by either doing it differently or in a more dedicated way rather than just doing a ton of
I don't know. I mean, I think the research that I've read and that I wrote about in the book is kind of about the opposite. That the best way to practice and to hone your skills, whatever it is, whether it's chess or football, is by practicing in a fashion that's dedicated to the task that you're expecting to experience. I mean, and it gets back to not just the mental modeling and the mapping that we're talking about, but also the prediction element, right? Which I mentioned is I think probably the most crucial element that athletes employ to be able to do what they do. And when that prediction is thrown off, in the case of Federer and Djokovic, it can cause problems, but when it's really thrown off, your entire ability can crumble. There was a really interesting celebrity softball game many years ago now where like Jenny Finch was the Olympic softball pitcher who was facing Barry Bonds and Albert Pujols and Brian Giles, all these Major League Baseball sluggers. And, these guys thought that Finch would, Finch was threw hard. And I think she threw like in the mid 90s, but nothing that was.
It was like 90 equitable, right? Like it was probably in the 70s, but because of
yes, yeah, okay. Exactly. But nothing that these guys aren't used to facing on an everyday basis and hammering the ball. And what happened? She threw underhand and completely foiled their entire prediction mechanism to the point that several of them couldn't even get the bat off their shoulders to be able to swing. They could not see the ball coming. When those situations happen, when your prediction mechanism is so thrown off, because you've put because they put so much time and energy into practicing a certain task, when you're thrown something that you're not expecting, it can completely thrown off. I mean, I think that's a little bit of a misconception about the 10,000 hours rule is related to this. The 10,000 hours rule, first of all, it's a lot of time. It is one of the major kind of things that people don't realize is 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, deliberate being the key. I mean, and so practicing what you are planning to execute in a deliberate manner for 10,000 hours, whatever you want to say, if it's required for expertise or it's just a kind of a baseline estimate of what it takes to become an expert in something. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of dedication and focus. And after that point, you're going to be able, your prediction mechanisms for what you're going to face are pretty well honed. And so being thrown off from that can crumble that mechanism.
So let's take that into the motor learning, motor control realm. Whereas, there's 10,000 dedicated hours of practice, but there has to be efficiencies that we create in how we learn something. What have you observed from that perspective? Obviously, I had Dr. Will Wu on. He talked about how focus of control or schema theory, these types of things can help us to adopt skills maybe more rapidly, more effectively, rather than grinding our bodies into dust like a Kobe Bryant or a Tiger Woods. What have you observed as, like 10,000 hours? I think that it's a good, obviously, average probably.
Yeah.
And the dedicated practice is very important. I think in a lot of the Gladwell, in the Gladwell book, people breeze over that part quite a bit.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely of the belief that there are people, Steph Curry, for example, in particular, that have approached learning in a very intentional way. And because of their approach to learning, they're able to get further in the same amount of time or further in a shorter amount of time.
I think flexibility and kind of freedom of movement is an underrated, undervalued aspect of performance that is in some ways been not ignored, but actually kind of coached against in a lot of ways. Like I mentioned, that movement is really hard, right? It's very complex, right? Robots, as mentioned, can't do it, or can't do it the way that we can do it. And so we have also the brain has figured out ways to make complex movements easier or more efficient with smoothness, by not necessarily incorporating every single joint and every single muscle and every movement we make. And of course, this happens. We don't think about it happening, but it is happening when we're reaching, when we're walking, when we're making movements. And so, there was a Russian physiologist in the early 20th century named Nikolai Bernstein, who I wrote about in the book. And one day he was watching blacksmiths hammering whatever they're hammering, black metal,
yeah.
steel. And he was watching the blacksmith taking the hammer back, the arc of the hammer coming back and the arc of the hammer coming down. And he was noticing that the arcs were changing, were variable each time. But the blacksmith was striking the metal in the same spot every time with perfect precision. And so he ended up charting this arc and this movement. And he kind of coined this phrase, repetition without repetition, meaning that you can repeat the same outcome without necessarily repeating the movements to get to that point. The truth is that we can't repeat the movements to get to that point. Every one of our movements is inherently variable due to motor noise, due to fatigue, due to, any number of elements about why. But there's inherently going to be variability in every single movement we make. It's why, try writing your name the same way every time. It's not going to happen, right? There's going to be some perturbation, some difference in how we sign our name, how we make every movement. So knowing that, it always kind of strikes me as odd that coaches, especially youth coaches, are trying to instruct through fundamentals that want the players to move in the exact same way every single time. And I think this is kind of it's a flawed philosophy and actually a real problem of overcoaching. There's certainly it's important to understand fundamentals and basics. And I think let's take a tennis serve, for instance. If you're learning how to serve in tennis, there are constraints that anybody has to kind of work within. Most of these constraints are physics related. If you want the ball to land in a certain spot at a certain speed, as you know, with a certain amount of spin, you're going to have to hit the ball in a certain angle at a certain point, right? Like there's physics that you cannot get around. But getting to that point, getting to that, like the arc of the blacksmith, the outcome can be repeatable and successful each time, even if the repetition to get there, the movement to get there is not. But that's not typically how a lot of coaching is done today, right? Again, especially with youth coaching, there's a lot of, this is how I was taught. This is how I want your form to look like, even if it doesn't work for every kid. I mean, I loved your interview with Furyk, who talked about how he developed his swing, which was largely based on feel. It was not based on the mechanics of what it was supposed to be. Yes, he had to hone those mechanics later on, and there's certain physics of what he's trying to do with each shot that cannot be worked around or avoided. But the element of feel and personalization of movements, and like I said, freedom and flexibility of how you move, thinking more about constraints rather than strict fundamentals and form, I think is a much more natural approach to generating skilled movement.
So I talked a little bit in my episode with Corey Jez. He was saying that how coaching is done now is different. It's starting to change, where you can go to a gym and there's a NOAA system, shooting system, where you can look at the attack angle the ball's coming into the hoop at, or you have TrackMan in golf where you can see the stats. And it's a lot more focused on hitting the numbers rather than how you get to those numbers, which I think is really cool.
Yeah.
I think that there's also some challenges with that. I mean, so for example, in golf, a lot of people can chase the numbers too much, or we get way too invested in the outcome, especially for beginner golfers, where hitting in a net is actually good because you can focus on what the club is doing more so than what the ball is doing, because you have to control the club before you can control the ball a lot of the time, right? But the broader part about that, which I think is really neat, and when I was studying Tiger Woods, I came across this a little bit, is that he was actually training feel. So he's thinking about the end ranges, and by knowing what the end ranges are, you can start to refine where you believe you are in space. Yeah. We see this a lot, and I've experienced this a lot when I grew up playing golf, is that first you see yourself on video for the first time, and you're like, no way that's what it looks like, and that's what I'm doing. But over time, what you feel starts to match the reality of the video as you get better and better. And then eventually you can say, oh, I'm doing this, and it looks like that in the video. And those two things become one over time. Yeah. But I'd never extrapolated that I can actually refine the skill even further. I can refine and make it so that my feel is maybe not more consistent, but it creates a similar outcome more consistently. And to me, that was a huge epiphany from studying a lot of these things. Yeah. So something that I came across in the book that was almost alarming to me is that the idea of mirror neurons is an unproven concept. I had taken that for granted and thought that was legit science. And that's a correction that I've made in some of the stuff that I've done before. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and what some of the implications might be for how we thought learning was and how it versus how it actually is? Yeah,
I think, mirror neurons, my understanding is that mirror neurons were discovered in monkeys, but have yet to be discovered as a class of neuron or proven to be existing as a class of neuron in humans. There has been established if not individual neurons that can effectively, help the brain mimic what it's seeing. That was the concept of a mirror neuron. Monkey see, monkey do. The monkey can see what's transpiring in front of it, and then be able to replicate it. And that's how a lot of motor learning takes place. We are visual learners primarily, right? So theoretically and intuitively, it would make sense that we would have I guess some neurons or regions in the brain that would be able to accomplish that. And in fact, there are. I mean, there may not be a class of neurons that do it, but there are regions of the brain. It's known as the action observation network. It's a handful of brain regions. I off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you exactly which ones there are, but this is the part of the region of the brain that is responsible for our ability to see what's happening and be able to kind of internalize that motion, that motor element that we're just seeing, and then replicate it ourselves. And this has been shown in a lot of dance studies where dancers can watch an instructor perform a move, and then with their brain, if they're sitting in a scanner, they can see something, and then they will show activation in this action observation network that is essentially activating and internalizing what they're seeing, and then be able to go achieve that motorically out on the dance floor. Where it's also been shown kind of interestingly is in visualization, where we can visualize how we want an action to be performed, can actually stimulate the motor portions of the brain that are responsible for that action to eventually unfold. And so visualization has become it's become more mainstream and incorporated into athletes. You see more baseball players, like I know Pete Alonso of the Mets, before every pitch and at bat, he takes a step back. He closes his eyes. He's visualizing what he's going to see. And so there is, scientific backing that justifies what he's doing as actually preparing his motor areas to be able to react and respond in the way that they're supposed to. So that's the closest we've come to mirror neurons in humans. Sorry to burst your bubble there.
It's all right. I'm going to dive deeper into that. I mean, the next series that I'm doing is on Michael Phelps, and he is one of the largest proponents of visualization. He was said to be running through entire races before they happened, and he was unbelievably good at essentially hitting his goals right on the numbers, which is pretty crazy, where he's swimming these races and feeling all the time out. But the science of that to me is fascinating, and how that works. So I'm going to continue to dive in, and we'll probably talk a little bit more offline about that as well. So in terms of all of these things, what are some of the things that are actionable for maybe an athlete coming up or an athlete at a high level to be able to impact or adjust how they train?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the constraints-led approach. I think is starting to be more accepted in training and in sports science. I see more researchers that have been publishing studies on it, or leading with, or thinking more about training through constraints rather than form or function. That's probably more for the youth up and coming athlete. I mean, one of the things that for any athlete, for any performer, one of the things that I touched on in the book, and I think is worthwhile thinking about, is warming up to play for whatever they're doing. Are you just warming up your muscles? Robots don't need to warm up. If you robot ping pong player, you flip on the switch, it just goes ahead and hits. We're different. We have muscles, right? So part of the warm up, sure, it's about warming up the muscles and making sure you're loose, you don't have injury. Could that be done with a bunch of heating pads in the locker room? Yeah, I mean, it could. You could warm up the muscles that way. And there's actually been studies on just that, on taking heating pads, warming up athletes in the locker room before a match, and then comparing how they performed versus somebody who did a traditional warm up. And by and large, they were far worse. Okay. And it had nothing to do with whether or not their muscles were warm or not, or they had no more injuries than the traditional warm up. The reason is just because they weren't warming up their brain, right? The primary purpose of a warm up is to recalibrate your brain for what you're going to experience. Again, what I said earlier, the brain is not just there to play basketball. We weren't born with a brain for basketball. The brain is there to keep you alive as you drive to the arena. It's there to make sure when you're crossing the street, you don't get hit by a car. It's there to, make sure you tie your shoes, you lace up your shoes correctly. It's doing a lot of other things in between the last time you played and practiced and the next time you play. And so it takes a little bit of time to readjust, to get back into that playing form, that mindset that this is what it's going to be. And it's not, again, it's not just a mental, psychological flip of the switch. I'm talking also the way that the brain coordinates with the muscles and all the prediction mechanisms, the mental mapping, the working memory, all those things that we talked about, elite athletes need in order to perform. Those things also need to be recalibrated in order to perform. And so a warm up that is just going through the motions is probably not going to be as effective as it could be.
As one with feedback or things along those lines?
As one that is, situational and actually going through what you're expected to be facing on the court or on the field. With obviously, keeping fatigue in mind and trying, not to overly exert, oneself, because I know, part of it is just, not having too many reps and fatigue and so on. As a sports writer, I saw so many warm-ups where, it's just like a wide receiver out in the football field catching passes with one hand, and that's their warm-up, or basketball players doing layup lines, or, the biggest offender are baseball players in batting practice, where they're taking softballs from coaches at, they're just and slamming home runs out of the ballpark. I mean, it's not actually preparing your brain for what it's going to face. And so, thinking about a warm up, not just being about the muscles. It's just not just thinking about the muscles. It's thinking about how the brain is preparing for what I'm going to do. I think can go a long way to to being ready to go right for the moment. I mean, what is rust? Like, what is rustiness? Why is it that it's more typical for the guy on the bench on the basketball team to miss a few shots before, once he comes into the game? It's because he's been sitting on the bench for a few minutes. Even in that short amount of time, your brain is drifting off, doing different things, thinking about other things. Even if you might be focused on the game, if you're not mentally visualizing and thinking about, what's going to happen, all those mechanisms that we talked about are going to start to slide, and it's going to take a little bit of time to get back into it. That's what rust is. So, as far as actionable advice, I'm all constantly baffled about how just useless a lot of warm-up exercises are.
That makes sense. And interestingly, I think golfers are one of the few athlete classes that have been pretty good at that. Mm-hmm. So Tiger, before every round, he would hit the exact shot that he's going to hit off the first tee. On the range, he'd practice it. There was one time during a rain delay where he had the side hill lie in the rough, and you get to hit balls during the rain delay to re-warm back up before you go back out. And he found the same line, he hit a couple out of that. And so to me, he's bringing that. The calibration side is also very interesting to me. So golfers, I think, do this less intuitively, but they go before the rounds and they're like, oh, the wind is like this today. The air density is like this. I have to figure out how far I'm hitting a 56-degree wedge, how far I'm hitting all my clubs. A lot of golfers check their numbers for all their clubs before they play every day. It might be some of the conditions, but it also might be that their speeds and how they're hitting the ball that day is actually a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And so they're calibrating their body for how far they're expecting to hit it, as well as the conditions, which they might not be internalizing. It might be, I don't change it all, and the conditions are, but in fact, it's probably both of those factors that are changing. Yeah. Another person who I think did this pretty well was Kobe Bryant, where I think he probably didn't warm up in the targeted way exactly as you described. I think it was probably closer than a lot of guys.
Probably.
But he was constantly talking about how he had to adjust his practice, his routine, everything to how he was feeling that day. Mm-hmm. He had to change his psychology to every game. Do I need to be amped up for this game? Do I need to be a little bit more calm and take on a leadership role? Do I have to be a facilitator for this game? And that level of introspection, I think is overlooked by a lot of athletes at every single level. And it's refreshing to hear you say that also, because, you know, that's often a part where we don't think about. I mean, a lot of the prevailing wisdom is your job is done when the game starts effectively, and just go out and execute.
Right.
But if you're not setting yourself up to execute by doing that calibration, you're kind of failing yourself and your athletes that you're coaching at the same time too.
Yeah. You're not preparing them to the best of that it could be. I mean, I thought it was when I read some studies about warm-ups, I was like, it really did make me rethink what a warm-up is for. And I think, it should be carried on more broadly. Yeah.
So going a little bit different direction, what got you interested in all this to begin with? I think it's really important for us to maybe level set. It's a little late in the interview to do this, but
I'm Zach.
But I'm inherently interested in that aspect of it too, because where you're coming from helps us to understand where you're going.
Sure.
Right?
Well, I was a sports writer for about a decade, and but I came to this it was completely by happenstance. My wife saw a blurb in the Columbia alumni magazine about these two neuroscientists that were starting to study expert baseball hitters. I remember at the time, this was interesting to me because, I was familiar with sports psychology, obviously, and mental health was something that I was obviously familiar with. This is around 2015, and kind of like those brain apps like Lumosity were starting to gain traction and become popular. So there was a little bit of like brain stuff in the air, but I had not encountered neuroscientists that were interested in athletes in this way. I reached out to them. This is Jason Sherwin and Jordan Maraskin. This is before they even started their company, DeServo. Ended up running a story about them for a now defunct online sports magazine called SB Nation long form, and it was about their work and what they were doing. And they were just starting their company out of Columbia's startup labs, actually, and they were starting to consult with Major League Baseball teams at that time when the story ran. So the story got a little bit of attention, but I was, unlike most stories I tend to, if I write a story, I'm kind of just done with it and I move on. I never think about it again. But this one just kind of stuck with me, and it kind of tugged in a way that I was not, used to. And, I wanted to keep following Jason and Jordan and, figure out what they were finding as they were starting to work with more professional hitters. So that was part of it. And I also started to wonder or think, I as a sports writer, I would also get caught up and swept up in the sports industry ideas of what makes a great athlete. And that is they're bigger, faster, stronger. That's what LeBron James is. That's what everybody's looking for. But I kind of started to think that if Jason and Jordan are finding that there are differences in the brains of expert hitters that separate, the experts from the novices, and even individual differences among teammates in what separates teammates from each other based on what they're reading in the brain, then, maybe there is something going on up there that can explain a little bit about athleticism and performance. I also just kind of thought, as I said at the beginning, that I hadn't really read or been exposed to too much that explains how we move. How simple, how basic movements are orchestrated and coordinated through the brain and from the brain. I thought by kind of going in that direction and trying to explain how simple fundamental movements are made, it could help to explain and help us understand how elite movement is achieved, and actually help us appreciate what transpires as being pretty extraordinary, because it's so complicated for our simple movements to be made. Seeing LeBron James on a fast break is you can't help but marvel.
Well, it's funny to think about the impressiveness scale, where picking up a cup is probably like this far on the scale, and then what LeBron does is like that far on the scale, right? Where the mechanisms in place that have to be there for us to pick up a cup are only very, 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 very like incrementally different from what it takes to do what he does. And that extra little bit is where all the interesting stuff is. Just like the DNA match between humans and chimpanzees, right? Where maybe like a percent difference or something like that. Mm-hmm. Probably, I think it's less than that. But one of those species has cars and planes, and the other one is still like sticking twigs in holes. So it's really cool to think about that in the scheme of that. Is that you're right in writing it that way. You're actually debunking the bigger part of that equation, and then we have this only little bit extra to go when we talk about this additional nuance when it comes to these unbelievable performers. Mm-hmm. So from the book, what has transpired afterwards? So I know you've started the newsletter. I've really been enjoying reading those about essentially debunking what skill is, which I'm really enjoying. What have you found maybe since then that has been a little bit different?
I'm just kind of trying to stay up to date personally, honestly, on what research is out there with the newsletter. I mean, I think, for a while after the book, I followed DeCervo, and, they've kind of hit a little bit of a wall in the sports industry as far as how far that they're getting. And I think with them hitting a wall, I too kind of hit a wall with, what sort of research and reporting could be done in this space. Unfortunately, hopefully that begins to change. But I realize that, there are other ways to tackle and to approach, the subject of sports performance, or more specifically about, skill. And what is skill? What does it mean to be skilled? And so, with Substack and the newsletter, it's just kind of an opportunity, I think, to stay up to date with what sort of research is out there, kind of pick apart what stuff is, I think, more valid, and what stuff is, maybe not, doesn't kind of pass the smell test to me. Talk to researchers again, and those who are, if not directly interested or impacting this sports space, they at least can have some relevancy to sports. So it is an area that I think is still remains pretty untapped and unfilled. I don't know if I'm in better position to do it, but at least I'm attempting to fill some of the niche there.
Well, I think, I would consider this podcast also in a similar niche. And I think that it is a much needed space. There's so much mystery around sports performance still. Mm-hmm. And there's also, just as you described, a lot of hesitance to adopt truly science-based technology in broader sports. I look at my other work where I'm working in sports analytics, and I see that, some teams have adopted it. Largely baseball has adopted analytics, but there's front runners and then there's people that are laggards. And the question is, why would you not be adopting analytics, for example, in baseball, if it's clearly working for a lot of teams? If you look in industry, and I would argue that every single billion-dollar company is using analytics to inform their decision making, mm-hmm. is using data to inform their decision making. It seems like a no-brainer, but with the nature of sports, where it's wins and losses and not purely dollars and cents based on performance, somehow it gets lost in the mix. And this could be any technology that is reasonably useful. Why do you think that is? Is that some technologies that they could be very viable? I'm not going to make a claim on any of the specific technologies you've left in your book, but why are teams ignoring science?
Man, you I'm going to rant right now.
Go nuts.
All right. It drives me nuts. From the moment I started working on this book and started following Jason and Jordan, it was constantly one obstacle after another. And what I thought, and I don't think I'm the only one that thought this. Maybe I am crazy and thinking that peering into the brains of athletes could be useful and helpful to understanding what's going on. But maybe I am crazy. I'm the only one. But I thought that there would be more engagement, more willingness to do this type of experimenting in this direction, and there was just it was hurdle after hurdle. And I'll rant here for a second. I think there is a real aversion and a lack of a sense of adventure in sports today. There's just no willingness to experiment. It's lack of courage in a lot of ways. And you probably mentioned it probably has to do with unions and lawyers and and money. But I wrote in the book in 1921, Babe Ruth, after a Yankee game, in an afternoon game, he took the train down to Columbia and went through a battery of tests, testing his vision, testing his reaction time, testing, all these processes, the purpose of the tests were to understand what makes Babe Ruth. That was it. There was no money on the line. There was no sponsorship deal that he was trying to get from this. It was purely scientific, what makes Babe Ruth. And he did this. He willingly underwent this battery of tests. Were a lot of the tests did they ultimately prove to be a little flawed? Yeah, we can quibble with that a little bit.
Wasn't he like blind in his left eye or something like that?
He may have been a little bit, had a little bit of vision. That was later in life.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But would you ever see Shohei Ohtani do that today? You never in a million years would you see somebody like that, because there's too many reasons not to. Yep. Right. And the best reason to do it would be just a sense of adventure for the betterment of science and understanding about what makes us human and what makes us, performers. So what Jason and Jordan were encountering, and I think this is fairly common, especially with the more rigorous science-based tools and devices that are trying to make their way into sports, is that they had a hard time convincing teams that what they were producing was useful versus whether or not it was just science, just helpful for science. I was writing about them because they were helpful for science. They were using EEG caps to read and peer inside the brains of professional hitters in a way that no one else was doing. They were not claiming that this device was going to make their players better. They said that you can use this information, this data, to train differently, or you can use this data and information to scout differently. But there was nothing, by going through this process that was going to make a player better. And it was an intensive process. It's you have to wear a brain cap with electrode gel, and you have to sit in front of a screen for 40 minutes tapping at pitches and not pitches, swing or not swing. I'm not saying it was the most fun 40 minutes of these minor leaguers' lives, but the results were showing that, there were they were showing force for the purposes of science that there could be differences in hitters. And yeah, there needed to be more and much more testing to be done and all of that. But they couldn't get there because they were having a hard time proving to the teams that this is going to help the team win or lose. And so that's where the struggle, I think, lies a lot of times with companies and scientists that are trying to make their way in, is how much of this is being done for science, for the betterment of science, and how much is done for the betterment of the team. And obviously the teams only care about what's going to improve them, so and help them win or lose. So I wish that there was a maverick out there that would be willing to put themselves out there for the betterment of science, but it seems to be not the case. I mean, there was a great example of somebody who did do this a few years ago. It was Alex Honnold, the extreme climber, and he subjected himself to an fMRI a few years ago for I believe that was part of a documentary for National Geographic TV or something like that. Sure enough, I mean, the MRI results showed that Alex Honnold had less activation in his amygdala than regular people. The amygdala is the region of the brain that controls your fear, your responsiveness, your flight or fight responsiveness. And so the fact that Alex Honnold seemed to be genetically, fearless or whatever, he trained himself to be fearless, and it showed up in his brain scans as showing less activation in the amygdala. It's like, wow. It explains so much. Now, what could you get from putting LeBron James in a brain scanner? I mean, who knows? But it unfortunately just won't happen.
I agree, and to me that really pulled up my heartstrings quite a bit here, because I mean that's the whole mission of a podcast like this. Is I chose Kobe Bryant as the first episode because he dies in a freak helicopter accident, and there'll be no chance that anyone ever gets to ask him all of the questions about what made him successful. Or we could never measure a lot of the things about his brain or any of these types of things since that point. And the best we can do now is study it and go deep into his life and his story. And fortunately, I also chose him because he wrote the Mamba Mentality book, where he does point to some of those things. But there's a lot of things that he left out. And can we do the detective work to paint a more clear picture about what made him successful in that domain? He worked with the coach Todd Herman to create the Black Mamba alter ego. And there's this whole nuance associated with that story. But if no one tells that story, it eventually will get erased from history. Yeah. And to me, if we're not documenting the outliers in sports or the outliers in our world, that's one of the saddest things that we could possibly approach in our future, because we can't learn from those people in that way. Something to go back to what you're describing. I'll get off my soapbox.
I was on mine for a minute, so
but so it's interesting. I think the path is actually through individual athletes. Individual athletes are open to adopting some kind of weird things if they think it might help them. But the other side of that is that you just have to be really good at sales and really convincing versus really showing scientific rigor, which is inherently paradoxical. Not inherently paradoxical, but it tends to be paradoxical when scientists aren't necessarily the best at selling things, because there isn't certainty in science. I mean, I'm skeptical of any scientist. It's like 100% this is going to help you and it'll work.
Yeah.
And so, I personally like what I listen to the Whoop podcasts quite a bit. And I think they're doing something really cool where they're partnering with athletes, they're getting their biometric data, and the athletes are buying into it. I think like Kevin Durant, Rory McIlroy, Justin Thomas, Michael Phelps, they're all Whoop ambassadors. And maybe the commercial side of that is the best way that we're going to be able to get this information. And that is a little bit sad, I think, but it also is technically a resource where we might be able to see some of this stuff in a broader sense. And that excites me as well in that front. So maybe I'll get the CEO of Whoop to come on at some point, but
there was an effort by Nike years and years ago. I think it was like SPARQ that they were sort of trying to, I don't remember exactly what that was. It certainly wasn't neuroscience, but it definitely was in some sort of visual processing assessment that, they tried. And I don't know enough about why they gave up on it. I imagine it just had to do with brass tacks and not making enough money for them. But you're right. I think individual athletes are going to ultimately be the ones that are going to have to, show some curiosity and willingness to subject themselves to some, maybe slightly uncomfortable, or at least just not, not intuitively helpful testing. But I think we'll be able to reveal a lot about what makes them go.
Yeah. I'm finding more and more that the greatest athletes, the greatest teams, they're the ones that are most open to experimentation.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I totally agree.
Yeah. And again, that is also paradoxical. You'd think the teams that are laggard, or the athletes that aren't living up to their potential, would be digging in the bucket for more things. But I guess maybe that's my overarching large hypothesis, is that's actually what makes the great ones, is they're the ones that are willing to take those risks to maybe become worse before they get better, or to try things that don't pan out, because one of those 10 things might pan out and it will inevitably make them more successful. And that's an advantage that other people aren't having. Outside of the neuroscience, what do you think is the next evolution of performance in sports? Is there an innovation, a technology, a process that you think is going to come into the, maybe not the mainstream, but teams will start adopting to, or players will start adopting to take their stuff to the next level?
I think immersive technologies have come a long way. Immersive VR is specifically. VR in the past was always kind of bulky headsets and rudimentary games. That's really developed. I'm hearing more and more about athletes, whether it's football players or tennis players, hockey players, that are trying out, these much more comfortable form-fitting headsets, simulations that are much more lifelike and realistic, and can be tailored such that you're practicing what you're expecting, what you're going to expect. I know at LSU, the quarterback Jaden Daniels did this a lot, where he would, during the game week, he would, practice with VR, holding a football and would be practicing, matching up with the opponent's defensive video, essentially their video of how they played different opponents, and different plays that the defense would call. And he would, he'd be throwing, and, he at least said that it was extremely helpful in, when he actually got on the field, to matching up what he was expecting. And so, I mean, that's really the key, and where I think, the immersiveness had to align with what the real, scenario and situation is going to be. It needs to be as closely aligned as possible. If you're practicing, as I mentioned, if you're practicing something else, or if it's not closely corresponding with, what you're expecting to unfold, it can enforce bad habits. It can crumble your prediction mechanisms. So the closer you can get to a practice scenario, I mean, obviously the perfect, or the most, beneficial practice or scenario that you can have is a real practice setting where you're out there on the field and you're facing elements and you have defensive opponents that are unpredictable. That really can't be effectively reproduced or accurately reproduced, in a simulated setting. But I think the simulation is getting a lot better. And so that better equips your brain to not be as surprised, to be better prepared for predicting when they actually take the field.
Well, there's a great use case from Formula One, correct?
Mm-hmm.
I forget I'm not a Formula One fan yet.
Mm-hmm.
I'll eventually do a Formula One racer on the podcast,
Mm-hmm.
but I forget the guy. The movie was Gran Turismo that it was about, but he grew up playing essentially like the game, and then
Oh, yes, yeah.
He's like
I
probably,
don't know his name either.
Yeah, he's probably the most famous F1 racer, and it's embarrassing that I don't know. But maybe we'll AI edit it in that I know who it is. I'm just kidding.
I don't think I know who you're talking about, but I don't know his name either.
So,
but yeah, driving simulations have historically have been ahead of the game in this regard. Flight simulations are a similar thing. I mean, they're a little different. I mean, because you really don't have to incorporate the motor element into it, right? Those are activities or actions where you are just you are sitting there. Yes, you have to move in certain ways, but it's not like replicating what you have to do as a quarterback or a point guard. So it's a little different. It's easier to simulate in a VR setting with a headset, but I think the way
proof of concept at the very least.
Exactly. The way the simulations work are the way the simulations have improved, the way the headsets have become more, they're less intrusive. You forget you're wearing them. And if you can move around with them, that is, I think is kind of a new evolution in where sports training is going.
Amazing. Zach, the last thing I want to ask you about is sense of touch. I know this is something that you're getting deeper into. Mm-hmm. It's a passion of yours to learn about this. And I've seen it very interestingly in some of the stuff I've read. So there's a great story where Tiger is doing a club fitting, and there's 6 drivers he's using, and he tells his agent, "Oh, I like the heavy," or he tells the club fitter, he's like, "Oh, I like the heavier one better." And the club fitter's like, "These are all the same weight." And Tiger's like, "No, go weigh them." And so one of the clubs was 2 grams heavier because they left more epoxy in it. And he could tell by picking it up. He
wow,
trained
I didn't know that
sense
story.
of touch of these types of things
Wow.
So well.
That's crazy.
But touch is something important for athletes. Touch is important in our daily life. And I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about what you're looking into associated with that.
I started thinking more about the sense of touch as I was writing this book, because I started hearing more and more about the sensory component to sensory motor, from researchers who were talking about, obviously the book is focused on motor outputs, and that was really kind of purely the focus of what I was trying to do. But more and more I would talk to research, and they'd be like, well, you can't have any of this without the sensory. You can't do this without the sense of touch. It's why, we talked about robots, part of the reason why robots can't effectively recreate our movements, because they don't have the skin, they don't have the sensory element to that. So I just kind of was like, again, one of these things that just kind of has kicked around in my mind as being, well, maybe there is a sensory component to elite performance that we're disregarding or not really paying enough attention to. Just the very basics relationship between touch and movement is not really well understood or appreciated. And I remember we kind of think of them as two different things. We think of the skin primarily as just being kind of this blanket covering the organs and blood vessels and whatever. And it's, it's receiving signals about pain and touch and heat and things, and it's sending it up to the brain, and the brain does the rest. But really, the skin is a very active modality. It is almost making decisions and making sensory activations, without even in some cases the use of the brain at all. And we're starting to learn more and more about this. A lot of this touch research is still very novel and nascent, and so it's a burgeoning field. So that's kind of interesting and exciting as well. There's one study done in the 80s by this guy Roland Johansson in Sweden, who took, this is the kind of the best way to describe or to understand why sense and touch are inextricable, why touch and movement are inextricable, is that he had a woman, it was a female subject, and had her light a match, and so she lit the match easily, and then he took a pin or needle, and he pricked I believe her 3 of her fingers with a little numbing agent like anesthesia, and just knocked out a few mechanoreceptors. I mean, a very small amount, and had her try and light the match again. And she was completely unable to do it. I mean, she just fumbling the match, dropped it 3 times, couldn't even really orient it in her fingers. And eventually, after about a minute, was able to strike it. And, again, this had nothing to do with her motor output, nothing about her vision had changed, nothing about her signals from the brain to the muscles had changed. This was purely because her sense of touch was momentarily, knocked out. We experienced this on, for me, it's like a near nightly basis when I fall asleep, right, and my arm falls asleep. And, you wake up and you're like, oh, no, not again. I mean, and you really can't move your arm, at least for me, I'm like, it's numb. And in fact, it almost feels like it's not even there. I have no connection to it whatsoever. And because I have no connection to it, I cannot move it. And this, again, has nothing to do with the motor system. This is purely because of the way I was lying on the arm, I knocked out and numbed a few 1,000 mechanoreceptors along the arm. And so that sensory component was momentarily knocked offline. And as a result, without the sensory, I can't move it. And so again, getting back to where this fits into elite athleticism and performance, I mean, I think that it's just a question I have. Is there something about elite movement that can be explained by perhaps differences in the sensory, in how athletes feel or touch? It's their sensitivity. I think there has to be. One of the things that always kind of stuck with me was Deflategate with Tom Brady. What was that? It's like what was happening there. What it was Tom Brady was allegedly, although I think he admitted he did something at the latest roast, but told the trainer to lower the PSI, the pressure in the footballs. And the reason is that he felt the ball better. It felt better in his hands with a lower PSI. And because it felt better, he could throw the ball better. It's partly psychology, but I think it's also partly or mainly that sense of touch correlating to your actual motor performance in a way that I don't think gets enough attention or appreciation. I'm kicking it around as kind of something that I've been thinking more about at this point. I don't have any, projects that I can highlight right now. But if any of your listeners or watchers are also, talking about this space or interested or even doing research in this space, please, I hope they reach out to me because I love to talk about it more.
Absolutely. I forget what book I read it in. This is going to bother me. Oh, it was actually, well, I'm not going to say the book, but there was a college basketball game where they accidentally switched in a women's basketball. And you'd think, I mean, intuitively, maybe not if you've played basketball, but that you'd make more shots because the ball is smaller. It's an inch smaller in circumference, I believe. But the athletes shot terribly, as anyone who's played sport would imagine.
Yeah.
But just the feel of the ball and the slightly different characteristics, they're like, it feels wrong. And the coach is like, no, you're just missing shots. And then they switch the ball out and they're like, oh, actually it was the wrong ball.
Yeah.
But
I mean, you would, again, like you wouldn't think that would have anything to do with how they move, how the athlete moves their muscles, right? If we're going to break down movement as being how the muscles get orchestrated and coordinated, why should the feel have anything to do with that? But it clearly does. And in sports, we've always talked about feel, right? Whether a putter has good feel around the greens, or a short game has got good feel. Some some guys have better feel than others. Baseball players, some guys have just bad hands. But what does that actually mean? Does that really mean that they're less sensitive? They exhibit less tactile sensitivity, or tactile processing is worse than somebody else's? So that's kind of what I want to explore a little bit more.
Amazing. Well, I can't wait to learn more about that research. Zach, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Where can people learn more about you? Also, obviously, everyone check out this book. I really enjoyed it. Great overview. There's so much that we didn't cover, which I'm actually very excited about, because that means everyone listening has a lot more to learn.
What didn't we cover? Let's see. Let's go through it.
But what's the best way for people to keep up to date with what you're working on?
Well, I have a Substack, as you mentioned. It's zachschonbrun.substack.com, I think. Whatever that is. And yeah, so that comes out every couple of weeks. You can email me through there. I'm on Twitter at zschonbrun. And I have a website, zachschonbrun.com.
Amazing. Perfect. Thank you so much again for coming on.
Thanks, Ken.
And can't wait to catch up again.
Appreciate it. Thank you.